In the 31st month of the so-called special military operation, Putin probably realized that his nuclear club was not working. And now the Kremlin dwarf is looking for new ways to intimidate the West. But won't it turn out that he will only intimidate himself? We will talk about this with our guest Sergey Zhirnov, a former employee of the KGB of the SRSR and the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation, who is in touch with us. Sergey Olegovich, hello.
Hello, Anastasia. Hello to all our viewers.
Russia will conduct nuclear tests only if the Americans conduct them, Grybkov said about this, and says that Moscow can conduct nuclear tests, but it will not if the United States refrains from them. The infrastructure of the nuclear test site on the new land is in full readiness. This is a reaction to U.S. steps in this area, the Russian deputy foreign minister said, and says that in principle Russia is not going to strike with nuclear weapons, but earlier some media wrote that Russia could conduct an exercise, allegedly in response to the West's permission to hit the territory of the Russian Federation with long-range fire. But judging by Ryabkov's words, Moscow is no longer considering this option. Sergey Olegovich, why do you think they suddenly began to back off on nuclear weapons?
Well, first of all, of course, to say that this is perhaps the only good news that we have heard from the mouths of Russian officials recently. The problem is that no one believes them, because Moscow told us in January 22nd that it was not going to attack Ukraine. Yes, Moscow told us that it was not going there and that it was not killing civilians in Ukraine. Moscow told us that it did not seize the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. It just so happened that the Zaporizhzhia NPP itself ran to the Russian Federation with its legs. And Moscow did nothing in relation to this case. Therefore, in principle, this is a good statement. Another thing is that the reputation of the Russian Federation is such that no one believes it. Putin, of course, has a problem. This is a serious problem, which you mentioned when you have been scaring the whole world with a nuclear threat for 2.5 years. It worked at first. I can clearly confirm to you that on February 24, 2022, when I first mentioned the possibility of the Russian Federation using tactical nuclear weapons in the war launched against Ukraine, all the people who were with me in the television studio had a heart attack there. Well, I'm exaggerating, of course, but, in general, they were disgusted by this case. And then the presenters began to tell me that it was impossible to use these words so easily. 3 days later, when Putin summoned Gerasimov and Shoigu on February 27 and ordered them to increase the level of nuclear readiness, everyone realized that Moscow was really playing with this matter. Since then, every week out of 200 different Russian officials, either from Putin, or from Medvedev, or from Zakharova, or from Lavrov, or from Gerasimov, or from Shoigu, or from someone else, not to mention just propagandists, there have been conversations, constant from the nuclear system. And, of course, the people are used to this. I mean the people of the Western Philistine, because, strictly speaking, the Western military, in general, did not react very much to this matter. The military, you know, like surgeons, they have, so to speak, hardened nerves. They always proceed from the worst scenario and prepare for the worst scenario. Therefore, you can't scare them, so to speak. You can scare a burgher, you can scare a Philistine, and this Philistine will begin to give interviews or panic. The media can spread panic, and all of this will affect politics. The psychological impact is more of a Philistine politician through the Western media and, of course, through Russian propaganda. But even this Western Philistine and Western politicians are no longer afraid of Moscow's threats, because Moscow has repeatedly lied, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, and has also set some red lines. She said that God forbid Ukraine hit the Crimean bridge, something would just be terrible. Well, what was scary? There was, in general, an unpleasant thing, very unpleasant, really bad, because there were strikes after October 8, 2022, regular strikes every week, there on Mondays, on Tuesdays, a large number of missile attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. It really happened. But there was no question of any nuclear weapons. Then the same thing was said about Crimea. God forbid Ukraine to hit something there on the occupied Russian territory in Crimea. There will be a terrible answer. There was no terrible answer. Then the same thing happened in all sorts of occupied territories. Then it happened in the Kursk region. Well, in general, everyone understands. And then there were the same red lines regarding supplies from the West. So, first heavy weapons, then tanks, then some medium-range missiles. And she ended it all up with an F-16 fighter. Well, in general, we saw that neither the invasion of Ukrainian regular troops in the Kursk region, nor the use by Ukrainian troops of their weapons on the territory of the Russian Federation, including these bulges, 3 huge artillery depots over the past week, in general, did not change anything. Strikes on strategic airfields of Russian aviation, strikes on the Kremlin with drones on May 3, 2023, strikes almost on Putin's residence. It is clear that, in general, Russia did not really have any red lines. This is all puffing up cheeks, because, roughly speaking, at the front they are already using everything they can. They are already hitting Ukraine with everything they can, and they still have a shortage of what they had, so they bow to North Korea, so they bow to Iran, and so on. Only nuclear weapons remain. And now, why did they say today? And this is why we dedicate an analysis of our today's program to this.
Sergey Olegovich, sorry, I will interrupt you, but not only Ryabkov. Just a day earlier, Lavrov also said that Russia does not want a nuclear war and considers talk of pressing the red button inappropriate.
Well, first of all, this is, of course, natural. These conversations are about nothing, and they are taking place in the run-up to the UN General Assembly, which is considering this issue. President Zelensky will certainly raise this topic. Most likely Biden will also speak, who will also touch on this issue. They are already preparing in advance to present the Russian Federation as white and fluffy, which has never frightened anyone and is not going to use anything, and so on. But we are going around in circles here, because no matter what Lavrov, Ryabkov or Putin say, they have such a reputation that no one believes them anymore. And even when they say, in general, some soothing things, we, for example, on the contrary, strain more. But we have other soothing things. When they try to launch a heavy Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile, it explodes right in the silo. This is a blow that Putin did not expect. By the way, as you noted, this was done on the eve of the opening of the General Assembly session. This is the crater left by this. This is what you are showing now, illustrations of my words. This was done on purpose, that is, in the area of Arkhangelsk, the Plesetsk Cosmodrome. They tried to launch this very Sarmat from it, and as a result, a burned-out mine was left there, in which a rocket directly exploded. Apparently, she didn't even fly out of it. And this is a very big failure. And this now pushes the same Ryabkov to say that we didn't really want to, we didn't really scare him. Although this launch was timed precisely to frighten the international public, on the eve of President Zelensky's trip to the United States of America, on the eve of the meeting of the Security Council and the United Nations General Assembly. That is, in fact, all this was prepared on purpose, but when it didn't work, that's when they said that, we are actually peaceful people, we have a kind of peaceful Soviet tractor plowing the border.
The Kremlin is increasingly aware that the West is not exposed to Putin's nuclear threats, so it is looking for new ways to strengthen its red lines. The Washington Post writes about this, but Putin will probably strengthen the brown lines. But still, what else can Putin threaten? Will they transfer weapons to the houthis, sabotage the territory of NATO countries, or hit Ukraine again?
No, I think that in general the same thing will continue as it is now, but the warehouses that they have lost, 3 warehouses in the last week, are 3 months of bombing Ukraine. This is 3 months of waging war. In other words, in fact, this is a very serious loss, and not only in terms of texture, because a huge amount of ammunition exploded. They are talking about 1.5 million shells that exploded there, about a large number of missiles, various missiles, anti-missile, anti-aircraft and medium-range ballistic missiles. But not only this is bad, that is, it is already excellent for Ukraine in terms of texture, very bad for the Russian Federation, but it is also important that they exploded, among other things, at the storage facility, which in the storage facility that they built only in 1988, it was opened, and it was opened with fanfare. We saw these shots where they cut the ribbon. This Bulgakov, who, by the way, is the Deputy Minister of Defense and is still in the Lefortovo pre-trial detention center, is testifying about corruption. He then said that this new storage facility meets all international standards and can withstand not only direct strikes by enemy artillery, but also the consequences of a nuclear war. As it turned out, there was no need to wait for any nuclear war, and if any nuclear war began at all, then, strictly speaking, it had already begun even in the Russian Federation, because one of the storage facilities, when it exploded, a fireball rose above it, which was very reminiscent of a nuclear bomb.
At the same time, the Russian Federation is probably preparing strikes on Ukraine's nuclear energy facilities on the eve of winter, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Sybiha said recently. In particular, we are talking about open switchgears of nuclear power plants and transmission substations. The head of the OP called on the countries of the West and the Global South to respond to the preparation of this terror, and they refer, our leadership, to some intelligence. But even Russian propagandists are already openly saying this, that they are really ready to hit the substations that are involved in the nuclear power plant, and they can cause great damage. Let's listen to what Solovyov says.
Westerners say that it is necessary to give Ukraine the opportunity to strike deeper, because this is the only way to protect the remnants of the Ukrainian energy system from complete destruction, since there it is necessary to carry a blow at the 3 points that ensure the life of nuclear power plants, the 3 remaining Ukrainian ones, and then they will be forced to shut them down. So maybe he will hit them right away. Then it will make no sense to give permission to strike at our territory if we have already destroyed their energy system anyway. Well, I may agree with you, but not on the nuclear power plants themselves, of course. No, there are 3 facilities in front of each station, 1 facility that ensures their operation. This is a blow not to nuclear power plants, but to the substations that they have. Yes, well, it's high time.
It's high time, says Hodaranok. He must have been paid a lot of money. Earlier, he spoke differently, but still, Sergey Olegovich, do you think they do not refuse a nuclear provocation?
Well, you know, if it were easier to say that they are just irresponsible idiots, because to talk about such topics in the public space, on TV. I must reassure you a little, because a meeting of a very important IAEA Council has taken place. In my opinion, it was something like a general meeting of the IAEA, at which, at the initiative of 52 states, a resolution was adopted, in particular, on putting pressure on the Russian Federation to return the Zaporizhzhia NPP under the control of Ukraine, that is, the rightful owner.
На Российскую Федерацию о возвращении Запорожской АЭС под управление Украины, то есть законного собственника.
That is, in fact, the IAEA is monitoring this case, and it is trying to somehow regulate all these threats of the Russian Federation at its level. The problem is that all these international organizations, distinguishing the United Nations, they even sometimes have goodwill, and they can adopt some important resolutions. The problem is that they do not have a mechanism to enforce those resolutions. But the Western community, it is generally aware that the Russians are absolutely irresponsible idiots and dangerous suicides, because, of course, to talk about the need to bomb the substations that ensure the life of nuclear power plants, this should not be completely understood that as a result of this case, an incident like Chernobyl can occur at any moment. And to speak in all seriousness on TV is simply not just idiocy, but also irresponsible.
I would like to believe that these international organizations have some influence, but it seems that they do not, because on the night of September 22, the Russian Federation tried to simulate a Shard attack on the Khmelnytsky nuclear power plant. Energoatom is talking about this today. First, the drone sharply deviated from the initial trajectory towards the station, and then turned around and returned to the original trajectory. And this is not the first time.
Well, you see, these are scary stories. That is, it did not fly anywhere and did not hit anywhere. They are just so scary, they show that they can direct drones. Moreover, again, here I will calm you down a little, because a drone is somewhere around 30 to 40 kilograms of explosives. That is, even if it hits something, it is still not a serious explosion, that is, it will not be able to. Nuclear power plants are protected from this. Most of your plants are protected, because the Zaporizhzhia NPP, each reactor out of 6, they have a large concrete shell there. By the way, such a blow can inflict an absolutely terrible, completely terrible disaster at the Kursk nuclear power plant, because the Kursk nuclear power plant, it is made according to the Chernobyl type and it is completely unprotected. He does not have any protective sarcophagus at the nuclear reactor at the Kursk nuclear power plant. At your stations, I think, all of them have such things. But we see that this is not just an invention of propagandists on TV, but that they are engaged in provocations, including in the airspace of Ukraine. The only positive thing that we can mention here is that the Ukrainian side shows all these incidents to Western partners, saying that enough is changing, it is necessary to close the airspace of Ukraine completely. And this means hitting Western missiles from NATO territory in the airspace of Ukraine, preventing them from reaching their targets. And even better, to give Ukraine the opportunity to hit the territory of the Russian Federation with Western weapons, not even allowing drones and planes to take off from anywhere so that they fly towards Ukraine. And all these incidents, if there is any positive thing in their existence, is that each time they move the West closer to the goal pursued by the current political and military leadership of Ukraine, namely obtaining official permission to strike with Western weapons on the territory of the Russian Federation against all legitimate targets in this territory.
Putin's mouth Peskov today made a statement that the Kremlin will study the plan of Ukrainian President Zelensky if it is in official sources. We are talking about a plan for Ukraine's victory. Naturally, they cannot call it a plan for Ukraine's victory, so Zelensky's plan, which our president took to the United States of America in order to show Biden, Harris and Trump and in order to implement it. Sergey Olegovich, why is it that even Peskov is not as categorical as, for example, a couple of days ago, Zakharova came out and said, no, there will be no peace formulas, no meetings with Ukraine, and now they are ready to study this plan.
Well, because everyone is preparing for the United Nations General Assembly, so the rhetoric changes a few days, a few hours before this meeting. During this international meeting, you cannot say terrible things, because otherwise it will all be interpreted against the Russian Federation, so they change their rhetoric. In one of my broadcasts, under one of the broadcasts, one of my viewers wrote such a funny comment. He said that Russia would not participate in international conferences on the settlement of its war in Ukraine. This viewer wrote that Nazi Germany did not participate in the Tehran Conference, nor in the Yalta Conference, nor in the Potsdam Conference. No one invited her, and everything was calmly resolved without her. This suggests that the aggressor country does not have to be invited to the conference. But since some countries are putting pressure on Ukraine in the sense that it is necessary, well, how can we make a decision for it without the participation of the Russian Federation? The Ukrainian side said, well, okay, since you are putting pressure on us, we are not against someone representing this Russian Federation. Another thing is how it will take place, at what level, because we do not want to see Putin there. In any case, we have adopted a document that you cannot negotiate with Putin. And if not Putin, then will this person have authority there or several people who, therefore, will be part of the Russian delegation? This is a technical question. In fact, in this sense, Ukraine is playing the game that is being imposed on it, but at the same time it shows that, in general, this is a game of speckled cards on the part of the Russian Federation. And sir, well, if you want, let's invite. It is clear that they will not go there. And, by the way, here is the answer of the same Peskov, Lavrov and Zakharova that Russia is not going to go to any conference. Here it was for all these Putin festiers and for all Putin's trolls and Putin lobbyists who said, well, how can we do without Russia there, so to speak, at peace conferences? Well, we see that now, when every time an international community gathers, an international conference of significance, the Russian Federation is trying to change its rhetoric a little so that it is not simply shoved into its shit right at this meeting.
As for Zelensky's victory plan, he has 5 points, including the continuation of the Kursk operation and the receipt of modern weapons from the West, specific modern weapons. This was reported by Suspiln with reference to a source in the president's office. The implementation of the first 4 points is scheduled for the period from October to December, and the 5th after the war. And the main thing in this plan of victory is that it is complex. All points are interconnected in it. It is important to implement them together. Everything is in the complex. What is said there, says the source of the publication. Are the Russians afraid that this plan can really be implemented, or are they still looking forward to it?
Of course, they are afraid of it, yes, because, in this regard, I do not want to say that the presentation of this plan can radically change something in geopolitics. It's just that this plan is a very correct game of Ukrainian diplomacy, the Ukrainian president according to Western rules. Because the Western world, that's when there is a war against the Russian Federation, and Ukraine says, well, help us, give us maximum money, maximum weapons, and so on. And the Western world, after all, it is organized according to certain rules, and according to these rules, you need to submit a business plan, roughly speaking, some kind of, I don't know, a document, a report, such a global plan that will show what you want to achieve, by what means, in what time frame, and so on. Without this, people in international organizations and in the business community simply do not understand, do not know how to organize work differently. And in this sense, Ukraine has realized that this document is needed simply to show that it has, so to speak, structural thinking. What it sees, it has strategic thinking, that it sees its goals clearly, that it is trying to achieve these goals. And thus, in this plan, which Zelensky brought to the Americans, he tried to formulate these goals as much as possible. By the way, even one name matters, because it is a plan for victory. Many people say, and, unfortunately, I have also repeatedly mentioned in our conversations, Anastasia, with you and your colleagues, that it seems that the Americans do not want Ukraine to win, and they do not want Russia to lose. And when President Zelensky carries a victory plan, This is, by the way, also diplomatic influence on American partners in order to make them understand that, in general, at some stage it is still necessary to call a spade sooner or later. Do they want Ukraine to win, and do they want Russia to lose, or don't they want it?
By the way, we remember how the US Congress, when they could not accept $60 billion in aid, they then demanded from the Biden administration just a victory plan, which would still happen to Ukraine. Biden seems to have handed it over, but with a great delay. But now President Zelensky will definitely bring what we need. In addition, Zelensky says that the Second Peace Summit should put an end, not an ellipsis, in this war. And as we said in early November, the whole plan will be ready. This will be a start and a foundation for talking in any format with Russia, in any format with any of its representatives, because there will be a plan and there is something to show. Well, as we can see, Ukraine is ready to talk with the Russian Federation, it is preparing a plan. And what should happen? More failures at the front or even more drones in the Russian Federation for Russia to agree to talk according to our plan as early as November.
Well, in general, strictly speaking, Putin should be killed or removed in the Russian Federation. That is, as long as Putin is in power in the Kremlin, the Russian Federation will not officially agree to sit down at any negotiating table, or to start any negotiations, nothing. Because Putin is an absolutely inadequate person. Putin is a man who does not admit his mistakes, and to sit down at the negotiating table from Ukraine is to admit that Ukraine, firstly, has imposed such a plan. Second, Putin does not recognize Ukraine as an equal and sovereign partner or party to the conflict, even in such terms. Putin, if you notice, constantly mentions the United States of America, NATO, the West, and so on. And he always says that Ukraine is, in general, not an independent player. This is just such a toy in the hands of the West. And therefore he says that if we of the Russian Federation need to negotiate with someone, then we need to negotiate directly with the West, which, so to speak, supplies assistance to Ukraine, and not to Ukraine itself. And the plan that President Zelensky is taking to the United States of America is a plan to defeat Russia. Moreover, the plan for a sovereign Ukraine, victory over the Russian Federation. But Putin will never admit it. This must be understood, because Putin simply does not want to recognize the sovereignty of Ukraine as a separate state that deserves respect. Despite the fact that he has not been able to bring Ukraine to its knees with his armed actions for 2.5 years, as long as Putin sits in the Kremlin, nothing will change. Either he himself must leave, or someone must remove him. Only then it will be possible to talk about some changes in Russia.
Ничего не сдвинется никуда. Вот как его, то ли сам он должен умереть, то ли его кто-то должен сместить. Вот только тогда в России можно будет говорить о каких-то изменениях.
And, by the way, the changes at the front, if you notice, for example, the entry into the Kursk region, seems significant, because regular troops are already crossing the territory of the Russian Federation. However, Putin does not recognize this as a fact. He continues to call them bandits, terrorists, and so on. He is doing everything possible not to admit that the regular troops of sovereign Ukraine have entered the territory of the Russian Federation.
You say that you must either kill or remove Putin. Is it really this fall?
Well, judging by the way the Ministry of Defense is being framed, how the Ministry of Defense is being destroyed from within, there are forces in Russia that do not want to continue this war or such a war as Putin is waging it. Yes, because it is absolutely clear that all the imprisonments, mass imprisonments of generals, mass imprisonments of deputy defense ministers, the destruction of the central apparatus of the ministry, all this is directed against this. Plus, there are some rumors circulating that there will be even further landings. That is, in fact, there is an anti-war party around Putin, but we must understand that this is not a party of peace. This is just a more rational party, which says that Putin has started a suicidal war, which is not beneficial to the Russian Federation, which cannot win the Russian Federation, and therefore it is necessary to stop such a war. And, by the way, this party of rationalists, through the mouth of Kiriyenko, announced a new step, which we have not heard of so far, that it is necessary to shoot for corruption all those who are now in the occupied territories. Instead of managing these territories, they are mainly engaged in cutting the state budget of the Russian Federation. This is also a move by this party of rationalists, led by Chemyzov and Kiriyenko, which is waging an internal Kremlin struggle against the party of war, led by Patrushev and others, such as Sechin and the current Minister of Defense Belousov.
Во главе с Патрушевым каким-нибудь, которого отставили уже, с Сечиным и даже с нынешним министром обороны Белоусовым.
A record number of Russians have come out in favor of ending the war without achieving Putin's goals, the Moscow Times reports, citing the results of a survey by the Chronicle Project and the Extreme Scan Research Group. 63% of respondents would like Russia and Ukraine to agree on peace with mutual concessions in the coming year. Almost half, which is 49% of Russian citizens, would support the withdrawal of Russian troops from the territory of Ukraine and peace talks with Ukraine without achieving the goals of the so-called special military operation. And 30% of Russians said they were not ready to go to war. Such high rates are the first time since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Sergey Olegovich, I do not know how realistic it is to conduct any polls in Russia, and it is a totalitarian country, a repressive, Putinist machine, but nevertheless, if this is something approximately correct, then what do these figures say? Where did they come from?
You know, this is a very interesting sociological survey. I have also read about it, and I agree with you that sociology in a totalitarian state either does not exist, or there is very little. And what is indicative is that even in the conditions of this authoritarian state, if such a poll shows such figures, then in fact everything is still much better for Ukraine, worse for Russia. That is, in fact, the number of people who will agree that Russia will conditionally withdraw its troops without, so to speak, receiving any benefits from this war, is actually much higher. Because people, it turns out, is how it is. Look, who in the Russian Federation is actively in favor of this war? Old men, Soviet old men, that is, pensioners who are over 70 years old, are in favor of it. They know that they will not be sent to this war. In their heads, there are Soviet ideas, old and outdated, about the greatness of the Soviet Union, which has already collapsed. They continue to praise Stalin and other such things. These absolutely poor people, by the way, absolutely idiotic people, they want some kind of greatness at the expense of waging war with a neighboring country. Young people do not need all this. Young people are afraid that the Russian Federation will announce mobilization. Young people do not want to get into this war. As we saw in the Kursk region, when young recruits encounter real combat regular units, they simply surrender. They do not conduct any hostilities. That's a lot of such a population. The whole problem with this poll is that this is all a common sociological fund, that is, roughly speaking, all these people are ready for Russia to lose, ready for Ukraine to win, ready for Russia to be forced to withdraw its troops. They will not do anything. But they will do nothing to achieve this goal. That is, this is a liability, this is an absolute liability, these are people who will agree with this, they will not stand up, they will not organize any rallies. And we realized this last year during Prigozhin's putsch. During Prigozhin's revolt, no one came out to defend Putin. And everyone was waiting and sitting to see how it would end, and watching from afar. And, in general, everything, in fact, except for some. That is, in Russia there is a minority that either makes money on this war, or just ideologically they have shit in their heads, which constantly thinks about some kind of greatness of the country, which is actually in full But most people are people who don't need this whole thing, who don't want to participate in this war, who turn a blind eye to it. But all this is done passively. And if some force, internal or external, forces the Putin regime to collapse and end this war, they will agree with this. But they will not do it themselves, nothing will happen.
By the way, 2 years ago, the Russian Federation announced the so-called partial mobilization. Russians were sent to fight in Ukraine, to die in Ukraine. And on September 21st, when it happened, this year, people gathered near the building of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, and an alleged protest action took place there. Relatives of the occupiers demanded that they be allowed to go home. Well, a small number, of course, but still they came to the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. Sergey Olegovich, what should be the number of people so that they can, without fear of these buses, which will be packed them, still go to the protests?
In the footage, you can see that about 20 people came out, maybe even less. This is an old story. Women of the mobilized, mothers and sisters who do not oppose the war, not against Putin, and not against the killing of Ukrainian civilians or soldiers in the war. They just want their husbands to return the mobilized from the front, as they were promised. That is, they were promised that you would fight there for 3 months, then others would be called up and sent to replace you. And as a result, these husbands have been sitting there for 2 years, and they do not demand the end of the war, they do not demand the resignation of Putin, they do not demand the overthrow of Putin, they do not demand the overthrow of the Putin regime, they just want to return their relatives. And in order to return him, they agree to call up some other people for the same mobilization. That's why, by the way, they don't really spin him, these aunts. Well, they, so to speak, regularly arrange their own such actions. To answer your direct question, how many people does it take for something to move? It takes 1 million to come out. If there is some kind of action that attracts 1 million people, then this action is significant. Because, look, at Navalny's funeral, it was 100,000. Sumano in a couple of days, right? But they also did not move anything. Just these 100,000 people, they came out, yes, they showed that they exist, they showed that they can go to the permitted rally. But if the action is allowed, if they know that no one will disperse them, and this, roughly speaking, was said publicly. Just like here, look when Nadezhdan was allowed to collect signatures. 211,000 people stood in queues, because it was a permitted action, and they showed that there were many of them. That is, the permitted actions do not cause problems, and even 200,000 people in 100 cities of the Russian Federation, at a temperature of -40 or -20, could stand for 3 hours to sign for Nadezhdan. That is, in fact, this sociology exists, but, as I told you, in general, on the one hand, it is very passive, because this very mobilization that we talked about, on September 21, 22, when Putin announced mobilization, 1 million Russians simply fled the Russian Federation. They just took it, sat down and left wherever they could. Someone went to Mongolia, someone to Georgia, someone to Armenia or Kazakhstan, and someone has better finances and opportunities, to Turkey, to the West, to the East or to China. They went anywhere, just not to stay on the territory of the Russian Federation. Then, when they saw that the mobilization turned out to be a toy, only 1,100 or 150 people were called, not affecting young people and large cities. In the end, half of this million returned, realizing that this is not the worst thing that can be. That is, in fact, the most mobile people prefer to escape. The population, in principle, does not want to participate in this war, except for those who earn money directly from it. That is, roughly speaking, when people go just earn their 20,000 euros or dollars for a contract with the Ministry of Defense, And even if they die there, their relatives, are still paid $7,000 in compensation. But everyone else doesn't care. And they just don't want to be a part of it. That is, they are morally and psychologically ready for Russia to lose this war, but they themselves will not do anything. Just like these mobilized aunties. But they can just marry their husband regularly, either to Putin's election headquarters, or to the Ministry of Defense. But they know that no one will twist them, because their husbands have weapons. No one will imprison him, they will be sentenced to 5 years, 10 years, and no one will lock him up in prison.
By the way, if this million, which you remembered, who left after the announcement of partial mobilization, really came out and did something, then, perhaps, this war did not last so long. In the Russian city of Omsk, 2 schoolchildren burned a Mi-8 helicopter at an airbase. Local publics report this. They threw a Molotov cocktail into the helicopter and fled the scene. However, they were soon detained. The 16-year-olds said they had been told in a telegram to pay $20,000, but they said they had not been paid. But I will remind you that a few days ago there was a similar situation. Teenagers also burned a helicopter in Noysk, and then schoolchildren were promised 5 million rubles. Well, recently we saw a lot of bangs on the railway in the Belgrade region. Sergey Olegovich, what is this activation of Russian unknown good people, and how is it that the FSB did not think that this game with setting fire to military cars, as we have now in Kyiv, in Kharkiv, in many cities in Ukraine, can be played by two?
Yes, of course, they did not think about this case, and they did not think that there are a huge number of people in the Russian Federation who are ready to participate in any schemes. Unfortunately, I have to confirm that my father, an elderly 90-year-old, was divorced, and we lost, probably, about $20,000. He secretly participated in all this nonsense. When the Ukrainian special services realized that it is easy to deceive the Russians for any action, promising 5–10 million rubles, this should be used. No need to waste your own energy, no need to train special operations fighters or recruit spies. You can simply find people who are ready to burn down their own house for the sake of the promised 5 million. Scammers from Russia. There are many such people, and it would be wrong not to use this mechanism from the point of view of waging war against the Russian Federation.
И не использовать этот механизм было бы неправильно с точки зрения введения войны против Российской Федерации.
But here it is also interesting that we have cars burning, and we are helicopters, and these are not the first. Not us. It's not us. It's some kind people.
Yes, 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 as the Israelis say that it was not us who blew up the pages at Hezbollah, this is obvious. And here, by the way, not only helicopters are burned to you, but also finished helicopters are ferried. Unfortunately, pilots are not very smart with money, and as a result, they pay with their lives for it. Well, no, it will be possible to find it. Of course, it is being done correctly, but the Russians used it in Ukraine. Ukraine has realized that any mechanism is always double-edged, and if the Russians were able to use something in Ukraine, then why can't Ukraine use it in the Russian Federation?
Logically, Sergey Olegovich, thank you very much for the conversation and for finding time for our broadcast. I wish you a good day and remind you that Sergey Zhirnov was in touch with us. You, friends, put your like, write a comment, do not forget to indicate from which city, from which country you are watching us, and, of course, subscribe to our YouTube channels. Thank you all for your attention, good news, take care of yourself and see you.
Thank you.